Today on Know the Truth with Philip De Courcy.
Grace giving is charitable. It ought to be marked and motivated by love. Or as someone put it this way, God is not just interested in the outward amount, He's interested in the inward motive. You can be generous in the gift and yet poor in the motive. We can do stuff for the wrong reason.
Grace is more than the gift that saves us. It's the power of God at work in us every single day, shaping our hearts and molding our lives to look more like Christ. Today on Know the Truth, Philip De Courcy, pastor of Kindred Community Church in Anaheim, California, shows us that this grace doesn't stop at salvation. It reaches into every part of life, including our giving. Now, here's Pastor Philip to inspire us with this encouraging message from 2 Corinthians and how to become a joyful giver.
I don't know if you've noticed this as you've read your New Testament, but Paul invariably begins and ends all of his letters with a reference to grace. We're going to come and look here at 2 Corinthians shortly, and you'll see that pattern also worked out. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 2, Paul says this, "Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ." When he finishes his letter, he finishes it in chapter 13, verse 14, "The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all." And that's a pattern you'll find repeated in all of his letters. If it's not in the first couple of verses, you'll find it in the early verses and latter verses of all of his letters. And it's not just a convention. It's not just a writing style. It's a way of thinking. For Paul, the Christian life, who we are, what we've become, what we're able to do, what we have, it all rests on God's free grace. From start to finish, the Christian life is a matter of grace, not karma, not law, but grace. So the fact that he begins and ends every letter in the same manner, it's more than a convention, it's a conviction. Grace is not simply a springboard, a launching point for the Christian experience. It's a foundation. It's beneath everything we are, have, do, and expect to be. That's why I like the words of C.L. Chase in his book, Grace-Focused Optimism. Grace is the sum and substance of God's handling of your life. Grace's fingerprints are in everything that happens to you, and let it be said, what doesn't happen to you. You live and move and have your being in grace. And we've been trying to argue that, haven't we, in our series, Total Grace? We've been trying to show grace as a kind of gem that has many facets to it. We've talked about saving grace. We've talked about serving grace. We've talked about suffering grace, singing grace, speaking grace, strengthening grace. We've been talking about sacrificing grace, gracious giving. That all of our giving is a reflex to God's giving. We've been looking at 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, where we have a historic record of Paul encouraging the Corinthians to complete a pledge they made to give to a collection that was being raised for the poor saints in Jerusalem. And as Paul talks about this collection, this money gift that was being indeed raised in Corinth, he describes it as an act of grace. In chapter 8 and verse 1, he speaks about the grace that was given to the Macedonian churches. In chapter 8 and verse 6, he talks about this act of grace. In verse 7, the grace of giving. In verse 14 of chapter 9, he speaks about the surpassing grace of God that was given to them. And so we want to kind of pick up where we left off as we look at the grace of giving. We looked at the motives of grace giving, and we started to look at the manner of grace giving. So far, we've identified 7 elements to the manner of grace giving. It's costly, consecrated, complete, considered, collective, commensurate, cheerful. But here's another one. Here's an eighth aspect to the manner in which you and I ought to give, or the manner in which God's money ought to be collected. Grace giving is certified. That's point number 8. Grace giving is certified. What do I mean by that? As we'll see here in verses 16 through 24 of chapter 8, when Paul sent Titus to collect the money from the Corinthians, the process was a protected process. Because handling money is a risky business. Those who handle it may be tempted. Those who handle it may become the subjects of suspicion by others. And so money must be handled carefully. I have a friend whose church was embezzled $300,000 by someone within the church. Handling money is a risky business. And so Paul sets before us here a kind of process. We won't read all these verses, but you'll see from verses 16 through 24 that Paul is sending Titus to Corinth to collect the money. Then Titus will join Paul on the journey to Jerusalem. It's also interesting that Paul sends 2 other people with Titus. We read indeed verse 18 of chapter 8, and we have sent with him, that's Titus, the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches, and not only that, but who was also chosen by the churches to travel with us with this gift, which is administered by us to the glory of the Lord himself. If you go on down to verse 22, and we have sent with them, that is Titus and this brother, another unnamed brother, probably known to them, who has often proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent because of the great confidence that we have in you. Point is simply this, and you can read about this also in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 to 4. As the collection is raised and lifted and managed, a process is put in place that will guard the integrity of the Apostle Paul, guard the integrity of those who are involved. It will ward them off against temptation and suspicion. Good practices are going to govern this collection and distribution of money for the saints in Jerusalem. There's actually 3 principles or patterns that jump out. There are many more probably. Do notice the kind of person involved. Although it's just the handling of money, it's physical, it's material. The qualification is spiritual. You'll notice concerning these 2 unnamed men that they are chosen by the church, known to the church. They have a good reputation in the church. They've been tested and proven diligent. Not anybody should be allowed to handle money. So the kind of person involved is someone who's independent, someone who's proven, chosen, prominent, impeachable. You'll notice that there are several people involved. Paul is involved, but not directly at this point. He guards himself by sending Titus, and then he guards Titus by sending 2 other brothers who, in a sense, guard each other. There's a plurality of spiritual people involved. Now, why is there more than one person involved? One, as they take the money to Jerusalem, it would have guarded them against the act of robbery. There's safety in numbers. I think that's one implication. And in number 2, the fact that there's more than 1 or 2 people involved, it would guard them against any accusation of pilfering or playing with the collection themselves. So it's a very wise move. And what motivates this process? Well, we read in verse 21, so that things may be done in an honorable way, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. So the motive is that we want to do this right. We want to handle this well so that God is pleased, God is honored in the way we do his work. And number 2, people can trust the process. In fact, the implication might be there in the sight of men. That's even those outside the church. The unbeliever can look at how the church handles its money and the way it conducts itself financially, and they go, you know what? I can trust this process. Now, sadly, across church history, the church has been stung by the mismanagement of money. But a good church and a godly church will work hard. None of our pastors in this church can write checks. People outside the leadership handle the collection on a Sunday, and there's more than one or two involved. There's a process not unlike this that guards us. You know, each year we come, we give statistics, we make ourselves accountable for where the money has gone and how the money's being used. That's all proper, and that's all the way it should be done. Just the point I want you to see. Grace giving is certified. It's marked by integrity. I like the story, in fact, that R. Kent Hughes tells in his commentary on 2 Corinthians. He tells of an old miser who was dying, and he called three of his friends, one a doctor, one a lawyer, one a pastor. And he said, you know what? They say you can't take it with you, but I'm going to prove them wrong. And he handed each one of these men an envelope with $100,000 in it. And he said, here's what I want you guys to do, so we can be sure about this process. When they're about to nail the lid on my coffin, you guys slip the envelope, said, I'm going to prove that you can take it with you. So the day comes, they're about to nail the lid on the coffin, and the guys put in the 3 envelopes. Shortly afterwards, at the wake, the doctor confesses with a conscience that's been stricken. He said, you know what, guys, I got to tell you the truth. I'm building a clinic in a disadvantaged area in the city, and so I kept $50,000 for the clinic, and I put the rest in the coffin. The lawyer said, well, since you're confessing, let me confess. He says, I've just established a legal defense fund for poor people, and so I kept $75,000. The pastor looked at them. He says, guys, I'm ashamed of you. I put a check in for the whole amount. I'm not sure that's a process marked by integrity, but Paul wants you and I to know that when it comes to the public handling of money for God's work, it should be conducted in a spiritual manner by people of the highest integrity for the glory of God and the reputation of the church. Let's move on. Here's another thought when we're looking at the manner of grace giving. Grace giving is charitable. Charitable. It's motivated by love. It's driven by a compassion and a desire to be a blessing to other people. The text is very clear. You'll see in chapter 8 and verse 8 concerning this collection for the saints in Jerusalem from Corinth. I speak not by commandment, but I am testing the sincerity of your love by the diligence of others. Now, in the verses preceding that one, he has held up the Macedonians, those in northern Greece, in places like Philippi and Colossae. He has held them up as an example. And he says, now we're going to prove the sincerity of your love. They have proven the sincerity of theirs. Out of their poverty, they have given liberally. So let's prove the sincerity of your love. You get a similar thought in chapter 8 and verse 24. Therefore, show to them and before the churches the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf. So I want you to see that grace giving is charitable. It ought to be marked and motivated by love. Now, you and I know instinctively that love needs to move from words to action. 1 John is all about that. John's very clear about the fact that you can't say you love a brother and then hate him in your behavior, because actions speak louder than words, don't they? 1 John 4:20, if someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. And he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? Again, earlier in that letter, he talks about, don't say to someone, be warmed and be filled. Take them down to Target and buy them a coat. Put your words into actions. But you and I know that right actions must be followed or underwritten by right attitudes. Because we want to move from words to action. But the danger is we can do the right thing the wrong way. So we want to move to action, that's good, but there's one step more. You've got to make sure that you're being motivated properly to do what you're doing. Motive's important. That's why Paul says to the Corinthians, I want to prove the sincerity of your love. That's getting into motive. He wants them to give out of compassion and love and a desire to bless the saints in Jerusalem. He doesn't want them to give grudgingly. He doesn't want them to give legalistically. He doesn't want them to give heartlessly. Compassion for and a desire to bless others is the outworking of the sincerity of love. That's the wellspring of all good giving. Or as someone put it this way, God is not just interested in the outward amount, He's interested in the inward motive. It's a good thought. Not just the outward amount. You can be generous in the gift and yet poor in the motive. In fact, if you think about this, I just put my pen down in my study as I thought about that. How God is interested in motives and how right actions must be underwritten by right attitudes. Because if not, you and I can do stuff. Even we can give to the church, we can give to the poor, we can alleviate poverty through our generosity, but we can do stuff for the wrong reason. Didn't the Pharisees do that? The Pharisees prayed, and the Pharisees fasted, and the Pharisees gave alms, that is, they gave generously to the poor. But Jesus tells us in Matthew 5 and 6 and 7, they did it to be seen of men. So they did the right thing, but they did it for the wrong reason. They didn't do it to glorify God. They didn't do it to bless others. Primarily, they did it for the accolades that would come their way. You can do stuff to be seen by men. You can do stuff out of a legalistic duty. You do it because you just know you have to do it. You may even be driven by a morbid fear of God. So you do it, but there's no heart in it. There's no love for God in it. That was the problem in Malachi's day. I mean, God speaks to Israel through Malachi. Read that little prophecy at the end of your Old Testament. God's nauseated by their worship. He's sick to his back teeth by the way they're acting. They're sacrificing. They're going to the temple. But you know what? It's all empty. It's all legalistic. It's all formal. So the worship doesn't please God. Here's another thought. We can do stuff to cover disobedience. You ever think about that one? You can act obediently to cover an act of disobedience elsewhere. Who's the best example of that? Saul. Remember how God told him to kill the king and obliterate the kingdom that attacked Israel? But he keeps some of the best sheep and livestock for himself. And Samuel comes waltzing along and finds him sacrificing the best of sheep to God. That's where we get that famous statement, God would rather that you obey than sacrifice. You look at Saul, he's offering the best of what he has. But what he has, he shouldn't have had. He shouldn't have kept that. He was to slaughter those animals. So he was doing an act of obedience to cover his disobedience. I'm just thinking that out for myself. That all spoke to me. Maybe it'll speak to you. The real danger of, hey, I don't want to just speak. I want to do. But that's not enough. I've not just got to do. I've got to do it with the right motive. In fact, the word sincere here is a Greek word that means without wax. And I've told you before, the ladies can identify with this. Maybe you're out shopping down at the local market and you decided you needed a piece of pottery for your home, something ceramic for your home. You could lift up a piece of pottery and it might look all good to the eye, but what you'd find in that day, the ladies would hold up the pieces of pottery to the sun. In fact, they'd go outside the tent or the bazaar and they'd hold it out to the sun because bad merchants would buy stuff that they knew had wax added to it. Maybe there was a crack in the pottery, and in those days you could take wax that you colored and just put it in the fine line and gloss over it. And to the naked eye, you wouldn't have noticed that, but the sunlight shows it out. And so if something was a genuine article, had the kind of good housekeeping stamp of approval on it, it was without wax. Without wax. And you and I have got to work hard at eradicating the wax of hypocrisy in our lives, where we do the right things, but not with the right motives. And Paul says, guys, not only do I want you to give, and I want you to give generously, I want you to complete what you promised, I want you to certify the whole process, I want you to make sure you're doing this for the right motive. Motive. Here's the last thought. Although the last thought of this thought, we have a bit to go yet. Grace giving is commendable. What I mean by that, it's interesting. Again, we're hop skipping and jumping across this passage. One of the little words that appears here and there is the word boasting. Paul boasted to the Macedonians about the Corinthians. Let me show you this. Did you notice at the end of chapter 8, verse 24, therefore show to them and before the churches the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf? We've told others about you guys. Now, earlier on in chapter 8, verses 1 to 5, he has boasted about the Macedonians. And he's used their generosity in the midst of their poverty to just light a fire under the Corinthians. But now we're learning that when he was in northern Greece, collecting the money from the Macedonians, he did say, do you know that the churches in the south have pledged to give generously to this also? So he boasted about Corinth while he was in Macedonia. As he writes here to them, look at chapter 9 and verse 3. Speaking again about the sending of Titus and all of that. Yet I have sent the brethren, basically inferred to you, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect. That as I said, you may be ready, lest if some Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we should be ashamed of this confident boasting. Interesting point, little wrinkle in the passage, something that you might overlook, but I think in not so subtle a manner, Paul is kind of embarrassing them into action. Embarrassing them into action. He's basically saying, hey, I've put my cards on the table. I told the Macedonians, you guys are going to come through. Now, in response to what I told them about you, they have come through. So here's the last thing you can do is embarrass me by not coming through. Don't leave me red-faced among the churches. I think he's also inferring, wouldn't it be an embarrassment now that we know that the churches in Macedonia, out of their poverty, gave liberally? And the implication seems to be, and I think geography and social economic standing tells us, the northern churches of Greece, like Philippi and Colossae, they were poorer than the southern churches of Greece, like Corinth. So there's also this added little thing mixed into it. Hey, don't be embarrassing me. I've boasted about you, and you know what? Wouldn't it be embarrassing if you don't come through? And it would be doubly embarrassing if the poorer churches outgive the richer churches. By the way, do we not feel embarrassed in the West at the giving of the churches in the East? And our poor brothers across the world who lay it on the line for Jesus Christ. But we sit in our air-conditioned sanctuaries in Britain and in America, and you know what? We're nowhere near as generous and as sacrificial as our brothers, comparatively speaking.
What a great message that was both challenging and encouraging. Pastor Philip De Courcy has been showing us how giving, when fueled by grace, becomes a source of true joy that allows us to live generous and abundant lives. And you're listening to Know the Truth. If you missed any part of today's message, catch up online when you visit us at ktt.org, or share this message with a friend. And while you're on our website, don't forget about Pastor Philip's weekly devotional, So True, which he created to encourage you with practical, life-changing truth from God's Word. In a world that often twists or misunderstands grace, it's vital to know what grace really means and how it can transform our lives. That's why when you support Know the Truth today, we'll send you Chuck Swindoll's powerful book, The Grace Awakening, a wonderful resource we think will open your eyes to the freedom and joy of living in God's grace. This book will help you break free from performance-based faith while guiding you into the liberating joy of God's grace. So request your copy today when you give a gift of any amount when you call 888-644-8811 or by visiting ktt.org. New to Know the Truth? We'd love to send you a free devotional, 7 Days of Truth, resting in God through prayer. It's a simple guide to help you build a consistent and meaningful prayer life. Request your copy today at ktt.org. I'm Wayne Shepherd. Join us tomorrow when Pastor Philip concludes this series, Total Grace, here on Know the Truth. Today's program was produced and sponsored by Know the Truth Incorporated. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."